Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ed Rojas. I am the organizer of Tactical Edge. Today, we come with the presence of Adrian Sanabria, a recognized and very well respected InfoSec professional who will be presenting on the current status of endpoint security. Him and I were having a chat before we came live, and the information that he's going to be presented it's really, really good. If you have not heard of Tactical Edge yet, uh, I invite you to visit the website. It's an event that will take place March 7 and 8, 2018 in Bogota, Colombia. In fact, it'll be our second year. Take a look at the experts that will be joining us in Bogota. Andy Ellis, CSO of Akamai, Vinicius Agostini, the CMO of Exeda. Exeda is Akamai's partner for Latin America. Martin Fisher, CISO of Northside Hospital. You have Jerry Bell, Director of Cybersecurity Management at IBM. And in fact, if you listen to the Defensive Sec podcast with Jerry and Andrew Callat, you will know that they will be coming and joining us in Bogota. So a lot of interesting people. Hopefully you consider paying a visit. And in fact, if you register now, you get a 50% discount. As with all events like this, we do need the support of the community. Last year, we counted with these recognized leaders as our sponsors. Right now, we count with Exeda, Tenable Networks, and Activos TI as sponsors. If you are interested in learning more about sponsorship opportunities, send us an email at contact or sponsors at tacticaledge.co, or visit the page, download the brochure, and fill in the contact form. Today's webinar is again with Adrian Sanabria. For those of you who don't know him, here's a brief bio, and I suggest that you follow him at Sawaba in Twitter. You may use the chat to post your questions, and Adrian will try to answer as many as possible during the webinar. We will have time after the webinar for additional questions. Adrian, thank you for being here. Welcome to Tactical Edge webinars.
Thank you, Ed. And 50% off, that's a good discount. Que sabor. All right. Yeah, so this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. And just to cover, a few things just right off, this presentation will be replayable. We're recording it. And the slides, we intend to make the slides available as well. So don't worry about screenshotting and taking notes. You can pay more attention to the messages. And I would love it if people get into the chat and post questions, throw stuff at me as I go through this. If you have any questions, don't wait till the end. You might forget. Just queue them up in there, and Ed will help me triage the questions and get them answered as we go. Like I said, one of my favorite topics. I think a big chunk of what we do in InfoSec gets really bogged down and tied up in defending Windows. And so it's a very hot topic. We know it's one of the top issues that enterprises are dealing with and facing still today. Several reasons why I like covering it. So I don't like talking about myself a whole lot, but just a few things here. Just want to get, through here that I've done a lot of different things, and that's influenced how I view the industry, how I view security problems, and how I go after solutions. I've been on both the red team and the blue team, and I understand the business side. I've been an industry analyst prior to starting Savage Security for about 4 years at 451 Research. And that was an eye-opener, understanding how the business side of things work. So, and that last point there, I encourage everyone to look for inspiration outside InfoSec. Go outside your bubbles, listen to DevOps podcasts, go to those webinars, look at how developers are doing things, how other parts of IT are doing things, even how entirely other verticals are doing things. Healthcare can teach us stuff, as bad as their security might be, they might have solutions that help us with our problems, so leave your mind open to inspiration outside InfoSec. All right, we're going to start with the big picture here. So I just noticed there are some animations in the slide, so I'll just let's imagine that the big picture lit up there. Forgot to check that when we checked this out yesterday, but no problem. Everything works. So just to kind of summarize what we're going to go over here, I mentioned endpoint security is primarily a Windows problem. We look at the other platforms. Absolutely, they make antivirus for Mac OS. And there are a lot of endpoint security problems outside of malware in general. Full disk encryption, device interrogation, understanding, what's installed on a device. All this goes to risks, dealing with different kinds of risks that are not necessarily an attacker coming after us. We want to preserve data. We want to make sure it's not getting leaked or stolen. Corporate espionage. I like to say we could entirely solve the malware problem today, and we still have plenty of issues to deal with here. So let's just keep that in mind. So technology's changed. We saw smartphones, which are really, these days, tiny laptops that we put in our pocket, come into the enterprise. We never fully solved that problem. Attacker tactics have changed and continue to change. We saw malware go polymorphic on the server side where we can't see, and that posed ultimately the big challenge that caused our industry to change. But it's been really difficult to keep up with that. So a lot of our defenses stayed the same, and in some cases got worse because as we add new technology, IoT, BYOD, as these new challenges present themselves, it's been really difficult to keep up with them. So in some cases, you could argue defenses have gotten worse as we've added new risks to our environments.
Hey, Adrian, sorry. So
yeah.
You just mentioned something very important that's very, very modern and a big issue, which is IoT, right? So IoT endpoint security. There's nothing.
Yeah.
So we have to use the mitigating controls that we have in place, hopefully, to detect anything. But as you said, the technology has changed, but the defenses have not. So any idea how to deal with that really quickly?
Yeah, sure. So, all we can do with IoT, with the existing stuff, we have to Band-Aid it. So if you look at a lot of the emerging IoT security solutions, which is, one of the areas we keep track of, a lot of them network-based. They're looking at, you've got to give it a copy of your traffic, so it's passively, looking at the packets flying by, for issues, or perhaps even in line, detecting and stopping attacks going after industrial IoT devices. So you have to go with a network solution, kind of wrap up existing insecure IoT with that. And there are a lot of solutions out there that are really solid to lock down new IoT stuff. And there's actually some really good security in IoT devices out there, but it kind of runs the whole gamut. Like some companies that care about it really have it right. They've got PKI, their certificates on devices. They authenticate their updates. They won't just install any random firmware. Like the one smart lock manufacturer managed to lock all their customers out of their wherever they had those locks installed, their homes, because they sent the firmware for the wrong device to the device, and it didn't do any kind of sanity check or authentication or validation of that firmware before applying it. So it self-bricked. It bricked itself, which is kind of horrifying. So yeah, there's still a lot of issues there. A lot of companies out there solving them. But yeah, the problem is, if these devices are going to exist for 20, 30 years, it's going to be a long time before we can remove those Band-Aids, and we actually have the proper baked in, not bolted on security in place. Right. So, and I'm not saying with this slide that there isn't room for innovation. There certainly is, but I think we really do have all the tools that we need to secure the endpoint at this point. I say that because I've seen people do it, and it takes a lot of work. All the options are out there. In many cases, most organizations own everything they need. I'm actually doing a workshop, not to, I won't even say where. I'll just, I'm not here to promote that, but on securing Windows using nothing but what's built into Windows, and I think it's entirely possible to do that. Windows has so much built into it, and we'll look at that a little bit later, that you can entirely secure it with the tools that come with it. So I believe this. I believe it's solved. The issue we have in information security is actually making it less secure. So yeah, we can lock it down to the point where it's unusable, but then we have to back up from that. We have to take steps back and say, okay, how do we balance usability and security here? And I chose with this slide to let usability win because it usually does in the enterprise. People need to do their jobs. We need to make money. We need to be functional. And that's kind of one of the first, gotchas or, things you want to avoid in the security world is breaking the user workflows. Nothing will get your product banned or torn out of an environment quicker if you're a vendor. So looking back at the evolution of endpoint security, if you have been around long enough or in this industry long enough, or even just using computers long enough, back in the day, AV was entirely focused on addressing malware issues, or almost entirely focused on that. There was some, reputation-based website stuff, filtering, inappropriate content in the workplace, but mostly it was AV. And then in the mid-2000s, we saw a ton of consolidation. I call it the first great endpoint security consolidation, where we had everything from VPN clients, NAC clients. If you remember, NAC was big in the mid-2000s before it, kind of blew up. Even host-based firewalls. This was before Windows and Mac. Linux, I think had a firewall in it back then, but Windows and Mac OS didn't. Later on they added it. And then later on, we got full disk encryption in Windows and Mac. So we stopped seeing these as standalone products. I don't think many people buy a standalone host-based firewall separately from other endpoint security controls these days. But they used to exist as separate products. And it used to be very confusing. You'd be purchasing 3, 6, 8 different endpoint security products, and you'd have all these agents running on your systems. They didn't work well together, and then it consolidated into these AV suites, which we call EPP now. Fast forward a bit to 2010, and the attackers changed tactics. We started seeing, like I mentioned before, polymorphism on the server side. So what we call exploit kits. We're regularly getting right past AV every single time. The bad guys set up their own versions of things like VirusTotal, where they could basically validate that their malware build was going to get past your security every time. And there are even guarantees out there. You could buy an exploit kit and it came with a money-back guarantee that you're going to get past enterprise AV solutions. If you fail to get past it, they give your money back. So that, AV, obviously the industry, the vendors had to change tactics. We saw the rise of a lot of new techniques, some of which we call next-gen AV now. We saw EDR pop up. There are now endpoint threat hunting solutions, all kinds of new stuff, exploit prevention. And again, we're in a case here where at the beginning of this presentation, I mentioned more than 50% of enterprises out there, and this comes from an old 451 research survey that was done. More than 50% are using 3 or more endpoint security solutions simultaneously. So you've got AV, next-gen AV, and potentially EDR all on the same box all at the same time. And of course, they're all lightweight agents. They all tell us, oh, this is a lightweight agent. It only uses 1% of CPU. It only uses, 100 megs of RAM. Yeah, but what happens when you have 12 lightweight agents on your endpoint, to do all these different things? All of a sudden, a dozen lightweight agents isn't all that lightweight anymore. So again, we're seeing consolidation. And we'll go into a little bit more details later on. So I'm going to try and pause less on these slides so I can get through all this. So again, you can get the slides later. Some of these slides are going to have a lot of details that you can dive in. You want to check out more closely later. So don't fret if I go too fast for you to take in the whole slide. So why the endpoint? I mentioned BYOD, bring your own device, people bringing in phones, laptops, even if it is a corporate asset. They're leaving the enterprise now on a regular basis. And that's a problem. When most of our security investment is in the perimeter, or things that only have visibility when they're on premises, that becomes a problem. We have to get our security controls onto the endpoint to ensure that they're still carried out even when the laptop leaves. And it is mostly, again, here, we're talking about Windows laptops to a high degree. I mean, if you're going to worry about data loss detection, insider threats, corporate espionage, then, we start getting into, if I've got a lot of Mac OS, a lot of Apple laptops, I'm going to want some kind of endpoint security there, some kind of data loss, endpoint data loss detection product or something like that. Not so much for malware, but definitely, for other endpoint security concerns. So, we have to consider, this MacBook, maybe it's at the corporate office during the day, but then it goes to a coffee shop and then it goes home. And then, we also have to take into account, and I've been telling endpoint security vendors this for years now, that people are going to do work from their personal devices. It's really hard to stop this, to prevent this. In a lot of cases, we don't want to prevent it. They're working extra hours. They're trying to get more work in, more work done from different places. So who are we to discourage that? I'm not entirely sure we should discourage that. But it presents another problem, because you've got this corporate laptop with, all of these expensive security controls implemented. But then they go home and they do work from home and none of those controls are there. You don't have your Cylance or your Sophos or, whatever you've bought for your corporate assets that's not on your employees' home systems. So now we're starting to see the likes of Cylance and Webroot, actually encouraging clients and building products to be used on personal systems as well. So I think that's a good trend, and I'm still pushing for that. I like to say, worry less about protecting the asset, worry about protecting the user. And in fact, with the indictment coming out about the big Yahoo hack, one of the things that we saw coming out of that is that they did target family members when they were targeting high-profile individuals. They would go after family members to get to those individuals, so that becomes if you're a high target individual or have one in your organization, you have to start worrying about that. So again, just highlighting the fact that out of many blind spots we have, endpoint is a big one. And a lot of our investments traditionally have been in the perimeter here, which I've got circled in the center. So we have to take that into account, that we have to spread out some of that investment to get rid of these blind spots. So just a visual way of getting that across. So where have we gone wrong with endpoint? So one of the things I think is really in the enterprise process. It's not so much with the products. It's in a lot of cases, especially when the exploit kits were at their peak. Things like Angler. These server-side polymorphic malware suites. We didn't have time to do root cause analysis. We didn't have time to see how they got onto our systems. Oftentimes we were just pulling them, re-imaging them, and putting them back out there to get infected again. So it's really important to have a tool set for that and to be able to do root cause analysis. Is it Flash vulnerabilities in your browser? Is it the Java plugin in your browser? Is it missing Windows patches? Is it missing Office patches? And are they coming in via phishing emails, with malicious documents. We really need to understand where the enterprise is failing there. We can't put that all on the vendors. We've got to be able to use these tools effectively and adjust and move on. So, and that brings us to process improvement. We've got to constantly be improving processes there. And I like to say, if you can reduce any attack surface, always do it. If you can give your people Chromebooks, go for it. That's a bunch less assets that can be easily infected by malware. That's less of a problem for IT. It may introduce other problems, again, like the data loss detection issue. Things like that might not be as easy on Chromebooks, even if they suit your employees perfectly, but you've got to balance and weigh those the pros and cons there. And the reason I have a picture of a chess set here, and actually in the animation I had two people playing Leapfrog, is that too much in the industry, we build solutions specifically for the problem of the day. And we don't consider what happens if we're very successful there. So arguably the endpoint security industry, next-gen AV and all that, has been very successful because we have seen a shift in attacker tactics. And they're not using malware anymore. Or they might be building malware as PowerShell scripts or into macros and things like that. And in many cases we see, executive impersonation fraud, where you just ask the CFO or the controller to transfer millions of dollars from your company's account into the bad guy's account, and it works. Or you ask HR for a list of all employees with, their social security numbers and everything, and it works. And that's not something that, your AV solution is going to solve for you.
I was going to ask that. That's interesting, because then we're beginning to equate users to endpoint. No longer just endpoint devices, but endpoints. Is that what you're getting at?
Well, what I'm getting at is when we solve one problem, one specific problem, like say we treat malware as a problem, and we solve that, the bad guys don't just give up. They're going to shift. They're going to try something else. If I can't hack you, Ed, and I'm after you, maybe I go after your family to get onto your devices. So that we have to play chess is the idea here. That a persistent threat, an attacker that's really determined to go after a company or an individual or whatever they're after, is not going to give up when one approach fails. They're going to have a whole checklist of things that they're going to try. So we have to play chess along with that and try to anticipate those moves.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so if we remember back in the late 2000s, whitelisting or application control, if you want to call it that, was huge. Tons of people were saying, "Oh, it's going to solve the malware problem," and then we realized, from a management perspective and a user perspective, it did break those workflows. It made it where employees couldn't do their jobs. So that didn't last very long. And this prediction that more than 50% of enterprises would totally have desktops and laptops locked down, I think it's safe to say didn't occur. Instead, we saw this become a niche application. But it's kind of coming back. We see more creative approaches to whitelisting. And my point here is that we shouldn't discard some of these options, when they can be useful. And a lot of times we discard them when just by themselves, they don't solve the problem. Instead we should look at whether it's machine learning, to detect malware, app control. I honestly think the best solution is going to come from using multiple techniques and combining them together. And as we see the market consolidate more and more, we'll have more and more options from a single purchase to do this. So it's common to see, like a lot of people don't know, Cylance actually has basic app control built into it. Microsoft has AppLocker, so it's free to you from Microsoft, even if you have a version of Windows that supports it, an enterprise version of Windows. So we have to take that into account. and use all the options available to us. So on to industry trends and terms. Going to explain some of this a bit. So this has actually evolved from the other times that I've given this, presented about this similar content in the past. I used to say the ability to stop threats without having to know about them beforehand. That's the big thing that makes next-gen antivirus next-gen. Now, as it's kind of evolved, it was always clear that next-gen AV was going to be a feature that would eventually get rolled into mainstream AV products. And I think we're at that point now. Largely, I think we've gotten to that point where next-gen AV has become a feature, and is starting to cease being a separate product. So now I define it a little bit differently, kind of openly, as a variety of techniques that can stop unknown threats. And then we also have EDR, which is becoming more popular, but you have to be careful with, because it requires a lot of additional work, people, labor to get value out of it. The actual acronym is Endpoint Detection and Response, but I find that calling it Endpoint Data Recorder is a more self-explanatory way to define that acronym. It gives you a better idea of what it does. So under next-gen AV, we've seen machine learning models. Cylance calls it AI, which is not inaccurate, but that's a totally different argument. We can argue about what AI is and isn't all day long. But yeah, so you create a model that should match bad stuff, and they train that model on millions and millions of pieces of malware, and it does a pretty decent job. And behavioral analysis is another approach. So if you see an executable, so a lot of this is post-execution. The malware has actually been able to execute. In some cases, they can actually do this before it's executed. But if you see it do something fishy, like try to delete your backups, or turn off shadow copies, and erase shadow copies, it's probably ransomware, and you can shut it down right away. Exploit prevention, these guys will actually throw a DLL into every process, and they look for well-known in-memory exploits. So buffer overflows, things like that. They can detect and stop because they live in every process. So kind of like a gatekeeper for that process, looking for dangerous syscalls and stuff like that. And there's some other novel techniques. There's probably a dozen companies out there that are the only company that do what they do in the way that they do it. They shim the kernel in some way. They make it look to malware like they're, there's one company that makes it look like they're actually a researcher, that the malware is being analyzed, and a lot of malware will go to sleep. It doesn't want to be, if it thinks it's in a researcher analysis environment, it goes to sleep. So it's kind of a weird niche. There's a bunch of stuff out there, and it'll either eventually go away or get acquired and become part of the new AV suite of the future. So myth busting time. Cylance has a lot of marketing dollars. They're the first in there, and now Symantec, CrowdStrike, Sophos acquired Invincia, who's doing machine learning stuff. It's a pretty broadly used technique at this point. So I wanted to address some of the myths there. So one of the things we hear a lot is that, this is a change from signature-based AV. And that's really inaccurate. AV hasn't, there's no certified AV product out there that, as a primary technique, just compares hashes of binaries. It says, okay, this piece of software that is unidentified matches known malware. It doesn't work that way, and it hasn't worked that way since the early 1990s. So, if it did, AV would have to download, gigabytes of databases onto your machine, or would constantly having to be, pinging some kind of cloud database to check and see if it's okay to run something. And they don't work that way. Some will do that as a secondary technique, but it really doesn't work that way. And machine learning is really not that big of a departure from how AV has been working. It's just a different technique. Building a predictive model, has been shown to be more effective, but it's also more false positive prone. So you have to kind of balance that with a lot of these machine learning based malware solutions. You have some kind of slider bar in the configuration where you can make it more or less aggressive, depending on your tolerance for false positives. Like maybe I download the latest NVIDIA drivers for my laptop, and Cylance tells me nope, that's malware. So that's one of the issues you run into, and you have to to some extent the vendor has to tune it to prevent that, and to some extent the users given control to make it more or less aggressive.
Adrian, can you go back really quick? And then item 4. Sorry, I was waiting.
I just teased my joke slide.
Item 4. Sorry about that. So the MLAI, is it the statement on item 4? Is it because of the newness? It still doesn't have enough of a database to learn and then to start predicting better? Is that going to get better with time, the larger the pool of information it has to glean from and learn from?
Arguably they probably have everything that's out there right now. So as malware evolves, they have to continue training that model and putting out that model. So I'm not sure if it will improve over time. This may be roughly as good as it gets, but arguably it's been pretty successful. And we've, you could argue, or you could at least anecdotally point to the fact that attackers have shifted. Exploit kits are almost not used at all anymore. And you could say that's at least partially due to improvements in endpoint security, like the the machine learning approach. So it may have already done its job here, and that's where we need to start playing chess and say, okay, now all the threats coming through are phishing without using malware, or scripting attacks, things that don't use compiled Windows binaries anymore. So that's a question for data scientists experienced with machine learning models. So I don't know if they'll get better and better in the future, or if this is about as good as we can hope for. So this is about the marketing term next generation, and people always ask, okay, if this is next generation, then what comes after that? What do you call that? And there's not really a good answer for that. I often joke, we just call it continuous next gen. That way we're always next gen. But, I think it's a term that has a limited usefulness. And we're probably at the point where what comes after next gen, nothing really. We just start calling it AV again. So all the stuff we're calling next gen AV, that's really just the norm. Those techniques that we classify as next gen AV need to be in what you're using now, and in a lot of cases they are, and it's just up to, you may not even be aware of it, because they don't have the marketing dollars that some other companies do to focus on the fact that they are using those techniques. But that really, what we went over earlier is next gen AV. That's already in all the major AV products out there, or almost all of them. So that has become the norm. So, I'm proposing we just go back to calling everything AV at this point. Except for EDR. EDR really is different. EDR's goal is not to detect and prevent malware directly. EDR's goal is to give you more visibility over what's going on your endpoint. I mentioned earlier the endpoint being a blind spot, and this is how we solve it. And the major problem with EDR, and the reason we didn't see it before recently, is that's going to be a lot of data. I remember back in 2004, I looked at pulling all our just Windows logs off of Windows endpoints into our SIM, and it would have filled up our SIM in something like 3 weeks. Like we couldn't even bring Windows logs in there. And these EDR products are pulling a heck of a lot more than just Windows logs. You're looking at file changes, at network connections, linking that to processes, trying to give you the whole story of what's going on in your endpoint, with the hopes of detecting if behavioral things, red flags that tell you this might be a piece of malware. So that's EDR. And then there's remediation and response, which doesn't get a lot of attention. A lot of times vendors, what they call remediation is isolating the machine, which to me, that's just containment. I call that containment. You're stopping the malware from spreading further, but you still have to do something with that endpoint after you get it isolated. You got to clean, that's someone's workstation, or maybe a server that does something important in production. So that's a whole area that hasn't gotten a huge amount of attention. And in most organizations, the rinse repeat cycle is, let's take that endpoint that got infected. We're going to copy data off. We're going to wipe it, reimage it, and put the user's data back on and hand it back to them. It's a very disruptive and expensive process, labor-wise. I've estimated that costs an enterprise anywhere from $600 to about $2,500 every time they get an infected machine and they go to reimage it, depending on the how much you're paying the person whose computer you just took away. So taking their salary into account, the security group, the service desk or help desk, whoever reimages the machine, taking all that into account. So we're starting to see in the market, well, not starting to see, it's been in products for a couple of years now, especially EDR products that have seen everything the malware has done. They're getting to a point of confidence now where they say, yeah, we think we can undo everything the malware's done, and you don't have to reimage, which potentially is a huge savings in time, and you can get away from disrupting that user that got infected, whether you feel like they deserve the disruption or not, as a lesson to them in getting infected. And that's another thing is, I hate to blame the users.
Yeah, no, definitely. But that activity is something that it has to be foolproof,
mm-hmm.
or give you at least the confidence that it has removed everything.
You have to have confidence in it.
Are we up to that point that we can have that type of confidence with a solution to do this automatically for us?
It's in products, and even Hexadite was one product that was largely dedicated to doing that. So the answer is all up to the customer. If the vendor can convince the customer or give them enough confidence that they'll use it, the features are out there. So it's almost like the easy button for malware infections. And you can test it. You can infect something on purpose and look over the result. But at the end of the day, even reimaging might not solve some of this stuff. Some of this stuff will embed into the BIOS or the boot record or something like that. Or, maybe the infection came from your email. You wipe the machine, you give it back to them, and that email with with the malware is still there. It just happens all over again.
Yeah, so, part of what you were saying before, root cause analysis, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's why it's important to understand what the malware does and where it came from. Prevent it from just happening again as soon as you clean it up. But and Microsoft acquired Hexadite. So I'm interested to see what they do with it. If they build it into something for free, or if it becomes a an additional subscription cost or something like that on top of Office 365. I don't know yet. So, and this is just an example. This is a calculator I put together to calculate the cost. Oh, I was wrong. So at the high end, it's actually $2,800 is the cost. And that's if an executive gets, we're considering like an executive salary there if they get infected. All right. So an interesting marketing trend that I think is kind of silly is talking about the percentage of malware you can stop. There's so much malware out there that 1% still represents millions of, individual malware binaries. So I just think it's kind of silly. So I guess I'm saying you can safely ignore this kind of marketing. It's more important what percentage that they stop. Is it the percentage that's going to get through that they're stopping? That's what I would care about. So again, we said, the bad guy doesn't just give up. When he doesn't get through, he tries something else. So that also makes it, less important to worry about percentages. Attacks just don't work that way. And, to show that as an example, if I've got a fenced in backyard or, pen for an animal or something like that, this is 99% coverage, it means they got out. that 1%, is an opportunity, not any kind of discouragement. And then I've got another example here.
Use that slide. I like that. The dog went.
And this is 0%. So say, like I said before, we solved the malware problem entirely. They'll just not use malware. Malware is not the only way, for an attacker to get what they're after. So you can even have 100% coverage and still get hacked. Maybe they find SQL injection in your website after they give up on the malware, for example. So the market view, what's going on in the endpoint market? So starting out with some, what I think are missteps in the industry, and I've been using these for a while, and I don't know if it's me harping on them that's had any effect on it, or if the industry and me are just thinking along the same terms. But we're starting to see some changes here. So again, the endpoint's important. The endpoint leaves the corporate network. I've seen a handful of solutions that claim to be agentless, which in other words means it only works for the devices that stay on the network. So it's fine for your desktops, but you need to have some kind of solution for the more mobile devices that are going to leave that corporate network. They're going to leave the safety of that. Products that break the user, I mentioned that before, that's just out the window. Occasionally we see these ultra super secure products that are ultimately unusable in a lot of environments. Multiple layers, we talked about that. Products that bury the customer in data. So again, I'm talking about EDR basically there. Before you jump into EDR, you need to make sure that you're fine with hiring 2 or 3 additional people to manage it in a very, very large storage solution, because it's going to generate a lot of data. And then making consumers a secondary priority. That was the point I was trying to get across with people doing work from home, from their personal systems, from non-corporate assets. I tell a lot of, this list is more for vendors, that they need to think about protecting the individual, not the asset, which means making a consumer product. I think companies that make a consumer-focused or a home-based product in addition to their enterprise product are in a better position there to cover everything.
Adrian, question. Do you see any merging of endpoint agents with walled garden DNS protection such as 9999 or Umbrella?
Merging of endpoint agents with walled garden. Yeah, so that's traditionally been a problem, because most of those DNS protection products have to know your external IP. They have to know where you're coming from. So yeah, that kind of locks them to the network that you're attached to. Absolutely, I think DNS is a really effective way to stop different kinds of malware. As long as they can figure out how to do that. Umbrella actually has, I used to use their home product, and they actually had an agent you would install in your system, and it would report back to OpenDNS what your external IP address is. So you could argue that back when they had that, and that was in the late 2000s, you could do that. You could go to Starbucks, and still have that OpenDNS protection by using them instead of whatever Starbucks assigns you. Merging, Yeah, potentially. They're actually we've seen a lot of startups, DNS security startups pop up in the last year or two that could be acquired by an endpoint company. So that absolutely could happen. And if it doesn't, you can still use it alongside. So let's see. At a high level, this is just how I break down the industry. And this actually used to be a 50-50 split, but we're actually seeing more on the complementary side than on the primary side. And I think the main reason for that has been consolidation in the market. We've seen a lot of the big existing companies kind of swallow up some of the next gen AV, some of the newer companies there, and even well-established companies. We saw Lumention and Heat software combined, which with Landesk. There were a ton of acquisitions around that whole ball of wax that's now called Ivanti. So yeah, we've seen a lot of, I think just in the last couple of years, about 30 acquisitions there. But yeah, I break it down into things that are really looking, I call it passive prevention platform, when you harden the platform. So if you think of like an iOS or Chrome OS, the reason we don't need an AV solution there is just because it's both hardened and you've choke down the source for executable code to a trusted source. So that's the Google Play Store or the Apple App Store. So they're looking for malicious stuff there for you. And with the introduction of Windows 10 S, that's the main thing that separates Windows 10 S from normal Windows 10 is the fact that it's locking you down to stuff from the Microsoft Store. Which is a good way to keep malware off a system. But, the moment somebody unlocks that and goes outside it, which you can't do with iOS easily, and you can't easily do with Chrome OS, which is why those are considered more secure. It's a little bit easier to do it with Microsoft and Android and Mac OS, so that I don't think it's coincidence that that's where we see the AV solutions more often. All right, and I'm not going to cover all this. This is actually some good stuff that I've got here. If you want to make the argument within your organization to make any purchases here, I talk about why these different solutions exist, why you might need it, and what it does. So this is a good cheat sheet to use. If you're discussing this or arguing for it. And then some pros and cons here. So jumping to the bottom line here, what I call labor to value ratio. That's the amount of time you have to put into a security product to get value out of it. And it's definitely lower with AV and next gen AV. They either do their job or they don't. When they don't do their job, that's when you turn to EDR, which is more of a, you're going to do more hunting in it. You're going to have more false positives with it just because of the nature of how it works. So that's where, maybe you can use a product like that if you have the staff to, or if you outsource it, if you use like an MSSP to do EDR, Red Canary is an example of an MSSP that does EDR exclusively for Carbon Black. Again, just looking at some of the pros and cons here with the amount of time that you have to sink into something for it to be valuable. Here's just a view of what I call the first great endpoint security consolidation. This is not all of them. You can tell there's not 30 circles on here, but this is kind of the highlights. So so we can finish in time here. I'm going to speed through a few of these. There's some things that started, that kind of kicked it off, which we mentioned, which is mainly nation states getting into hacking, more advanced approaches, which quickly filtered from nation states down to common criminals, which is a constant issue. We see 100 million pumped into Stuxnet, and then that gives the bad guys ideas, and it's kind of unavoidable. You can't use a nation state attack without also giving it to everyone. There's no way to use it but keep it under wraps that we've seen, especially with the shadow brokers leaks. And then here's a view into the second great endpoint security consolidation, which has just reached about the same size as the previous one, and it's not done yet. So this will be a bigger consolidation. And on my list, there are still 86 individual and enterprise level endpoint security solutions. So 86 is a lot. And like I said, I think 65% of those are, or 55% of those are complementary. They're not replacements. All right, so going into the future, what are we going to see? I think Microsoft, obviously they're taking security very seriously. We rarely see a major Microsoft update without some kind of new endpoint security trick up its sleeve. There's a lot of acronyms here, a lot of stuff. Yeah, I would recommend you look up all this stuff if you're not familiar with it, because everything on this list here, or just about everything on this list here, is free to you if you're using Microsoft Windows. So you should be familiar with all these. Yeah.
Lazy question. Is there, do you know of any book in the industry that goes through all of this stuff, or, like
a book
type of book? Yeah.
It moves too quickly. So that's one of the reasons they say they're shutting down Emmet as a separate offering, is that, Emmet was a way for them to showcase, the new prevention techniques that they came up with. So a lot of what you're seeing on this list came through Emmet initially, and then went into Windows proper. And they decided, we're just going to put it into Windows just right off. We're going to stop using Emmet as a, for experiments and stuff like that, because they've got their insider program anyway. So people are already going to get it early anyway. So they're, it'd be impossible to do a book on this, or it'd be impractical, because you'd need to change it every 3 or 6 months. Yeah.
It's a good gig.
Yeah. So, what I would recommend, check out Microsoft's SIR reports, SIR. Look up Microsoft SIR reports. They put them out roughly every 6 months, I think, or I don't know if they're supposed to be every quarter. They're not real good about bringing them out on a regular schedule, but when they do, they're chock full of really, really good information on how to protect Windows endpoints. And a lot of that is research on the kind of attacks and malware that we're seeing out there. So it's highly, highly recommend consuming those. They're easy to read and fairly short reads, and you can get a lot of good ideas on how to prevent attacks against stuff. So they'll tell you, like 98% of attacks on Windows last month came from old versions of Flash, and they get this information from people that use Defender. So they're actually analyzing what Defender's catching, and in some cases not catching. So the question becomes, is antivirus dead? Do we still need antivirus? How long do we still need antivirus for? Well, if you have to do PCI, you're probably going to be using antivirus just about forever. It takes, I think it'll take a while for antivirus for, what is it, requirement 4 or 5. I think it's 5 to come out of PCI. But for people who aren't as highly regulated, maybe this happens sooner, especially in cases where app control, whitelisting, some of the more effective hardening methods are easier to deploy in your environment. So this is kind of my roadmap of how I look at endpoint security evolving. And ultimately, I want you to focus on number 6, because I think that's where Microsoft is headed with that previous slide that I showed. But number 5 is really interesting. That's one we haven't talked about as much, I've mentioned data loss detection. I think at some point, if you look at every breach, a lot of breaches that get pushed into the media, the numbers we hear about, the number of records they've lost, are not the actual numbers of records they've lost. That's the potential number of records they could have lost. But because they didn't have something like EDR, they didn't have an effective SIM, they didn't have enough intelligence or enough data to be able to tell you what was lost. Generally, in a lot of these breaches, they get to the point where they know malware was on a system or an active attacker was on a system, and that's where the trail goes cold. That's where the trail ends. And eventually, I think we do have to get to that point where we have endpoint security agents or software or some kind of endpoint security control that can tell us, here's exactly what they accessed. They got 7 records or 70 records or 7 million records. And it's not just endpoint to do that. In an enterprise, you've got to see what queries are done against the database. You got to attribute that to an internal asset or user. And then you have to be able to detect, was that, exported to a CSV file? Was that then copied to a flash drive? That's a lot of stuff to track down, and that's a big chain of evidence across, network, servers, endpoints, to have to piece all together. And we're starting to see products in the market that can piece all that stuff together. So I think it'll be interesting if we, the path we take to get there. But I think you can do that today. There are enough products out there that you could tell the entire breach story today. And also, it'd be great if we got more details about breaches when companies had breaches. That would help us better tune where we're spending our time, right? So just some things to think about here. Do we need better AV at this point, or should we just use Windows Defender and put the rest of our focus elsewhere? Is it worth going with EDR and really tuning that and setting up alerts and chasing alerts every day, or should we just focus on better hardening? It's nice if you can do both, but a lot of companies can't. And then I wanted to share a lot of the free tools out there that if you're not going to use in production, you can at least use to kind of explore different strategies and tactics and techniques to keep your system safer. All right, and I think that's about all I have.
Well, thank you, Adrian. If anyone has any questions, please go ahead and post them. Or you can always just email. There's Adrian's email address. He'll be very happy to talk to you.
Yeah, or in Twitter. I like having public conversations on Twitter because everyone gets to see them. But
beautiful.
Send me a direct message if not, or send me an email if you want to have a private one.
Perfect. This information was fantastic. In fact, I was making notes here that this presentation was pretty good. It was non-commercial. It was very insightful, very useful, actualized, and it provided us real-world information and actual recommendations. So I mean,
thank
I
you,
got
Ed.
a lot out of this. This was fantastic. Really, really nice. Everyone, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you sometime soon. Please visit the website, tacticaledge.co, and come down to Bogota. It's a beautiful place. We'll talk later.
Share the presentation with your friends.
Yes, please. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.